There we go. Okay, there we go. That took a bit longer than I expected, but we hit episode 3 of season 2 of the Hoop Talk podcast with my co-host John D. It's been a week. How have you been in the past week? How have you been in the past week?
Not bad at all. Not bad at all. The Lakers dropped 2 games against the Suns and the Cavs that were hard to watch, but we had a get right game against Toronto. Penn, if you're watching, I apologize, but it was a much needed get right game. So it's been a decent week. It's been a decent week.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about the game I watched yesterday, so I'm just going to say, yeah, it's been a cool week in the NBA. Some teams are worse than expected, some teams a little bit better than expected, but we're here, as you know, continuing our series of the top 10 players in each position in the NBA. Last week, we did the shooting guards. The week prior, we did the point guards. So obviously, this week, it is the small forwards. Now, the biggest issue of this position, this NBA, now, I'm a huge fan of the versatility we have in the league. The biggest issue is figuring out who's a small forward and who's not. That's what I'd be struggling
100%.
with. A lot of guys who are typically small forwards now just play the 4 full time, so they're not going to be on today's list. I've seen someone give their prediction of the list, and it started with like a bunch of power forwards. So the small forward position has practically become the power forward position. So the small forwards, it was a lot of different players than what I expected, but I'll be lying if I said this list was easy to come up with. I definitely struggled with this list. John, how was the list for you?
I made multiple different lists. I'm not gonna lie. It took the last second for me to put together a top 10 small forwards list, just because of there's multiple different things you can value for these players, and once again, the shooting guard and small forward position thing is just really complicated. Some people would just call them wings. It doesn't matter where they really line up, whether it's the 2 or the 3, maybe even the 4. And there's just a lot of versatile players on this list, so that was the most difficult part for me, was trying to string together 10 set small forwards.
Yeah, I'm definitely on the side of I just call these guys wings at this point. But when we
Yeah.
are doing a positional ranking, you got to try and just siphon out who's what. I think I did a pretty good job. I'm sure John thinks he did a pretty good job, but maybe there will be some players who John has as a small forward who I had on the shooting guard list, or I might have on a power forward list, and vice versa. We don't know. But that's what makes doing these lists so fun. But as is our tradition on this part of the show, we start off with any honorable mentions. So, John, who were your honorable mentions, if any, for this list?
My first honorable mention is a guy who just over recent years has not been what he was in the past, and people still act like he's not a good player anymore, and that is Klay Thompson. Klay Thompson averaged 18 points per game on 39% from 3 on 9 3-point attempts a game. He's still very, very, very efficient despite the 0 for 10 game, which is going to happen to shooters, because if you stop shooting, you're not really making it a threat for your team. But I still think he's a phenomenal shooter. I think he's a great motion shooter. He's still an average defender. People like to say he's below average or he's terrible on defense. I think he can do a solid job at times, but I just don't think he is the level of defender that he once was. But the level of floor spacing that he's going to give Dallas all season, it so far it already looks really good. Last season he shot 38% off the catch, 41% on pull-ups, 45% in the mid-range, 39% above the break threes, which is something Dallas had an extremely bad problem against in the NBA Finals. So I just think he adds a very big weapon to this Dallas Mavericks offense, especially with how they like to run the offense through Luka with the spread pick and roll and having the space floored out around him. So I think he fits like a glove with this team, and I think he's going to have a great season with them. He just needed a new change of pace and a new scenery.
Klay Thompson was also someone I considered for my list. Ultimately, didn't make it, largely due to the defensive regression from his peak. I think it's pretty obvious if Klay Thompson was what he used to be defensively, he'd be on this list and he'd be pretty high up.
Yep.
He's obviously still one of the best shooters in the NBA. I mean, I know a lot can be said about his shot selection and then what he can do with the ball in his hands and how that leaves a lot to be desired. But when we talk about pure shooting, I still think there's not many better than Klay Thompson. I think he shot about 39% from 3 last year, 44% in the mid range. Still one of the best off ball players in the NBA. It's just when he, in my opinion, probably last year was out. For the sake of not trying to be disrespectful, I'll agree with you and say neutral defender. And then just he leaves so much on the table as an on-ball creator, which I think in the modern NBA, if you aren't going to provide high-level defensive value, I do think you have to provide value on the ball in terms of as a creator, which is also why one of my other honorable mentions didn't make the list too. Spoiler alert. But yeah, Klay was one who just didn't make the cut for me. But who else do you have as an honorable mention?
My second honorable mention is Michael Porter Jr. Now, he is still a very great pure shooter. He is amazing, and he fits well with what the Denver Nuggets are trying to do, and he creates mismatches just with his height against smaller teams. But when we look outside of that, it's not really anything else that he brings to the game, in my opinion. Being 6'10", I think he's probably a good rebounder to maybe average. He's not really good with the ball in his hand. He can't create for himself in the half court. He's not a solid defender, even though he has gotten better from where he was to the point where he was just a complete negative to now he's can be a positive at times. And his stats last season: 40% from 3 on 7 attempts, 43% off the catch on 5 attempts, 52% in the mid-range, and 39% above the break. He is a phenomenal shooter. He fits with what the Denver Nuggets are trying to do, but the playmaking is still not good. He's gotten better as a connective passer or as a swing guy, but he's just not ever going to be an above average playmaker. I don't think he's going to be an above average defender either. And I don't know. I just think he's too one-dimensional for me to have him as a top 10 small forward.
Yeah, I alluded to it in terms of the guys who don't have the on-ball creation and aren't the defensive monsters, how that's going to be a struggle to get them on the list. MPJ was the one I was alluding to. He was another one of my honorable mentions. Another one of the elite shooters in the NBA. I'm not going to say he's better than Klay because I'm going to respect what Klay Thompson has done, but MPJ last year, 50% from the mid-range, 40% from 3, one of the most deadly movement off the catch shooters in the NBA. Relatively efficient when you get to just one dribble pull-ups and step backs and all of those things, being able to shoot over people in the mid-range, shoot over people from 3. His shooting versatility, tremendously valuable. Defensively, I think still not a good defender, but does provide some value. So I'd paint him as maybe a slight negative to a neutral. Provides rebounding, which I do think helps his defensive case. Some rim protection, which is cool at 6'10" on the wing. A lot of things that I think are cool, but just no real standout skill outside of shooting. That wasn't enough to really get him on the list for me, but definitely someone I considered. Him and Klay kind of in the same molds. Klay, the slightly better decision maker, slightly better passer. MPJ, I think the better rim protector, and maybe just the more consistent within their role. So 2 guys I considered as honorable mentions, but both didn't quite make the cut. I want to use this time to give like a real quick shout out to someone who I kind of considered, but I kind of knew they weren't going to make the list, and that's Jaden McDaniels. He was one who kind of was like in the Klay Thompson mode, but not really in terms of only providing one elite skill. His elite skill just happens to be his point of attack defense. I think with him, he actually had a down year defensively, in my opinion, from what he was in 2023, but still one of the best defensive wings in the game. Very good at the point of attack, very good getting around screens. I know that Dallas series has left people questioning his defense because he was getting put in jail by Luka, but I'm going to just say it as simply as it can be. It's Luka. Against most other screens and most other pick and roll ball handlers, Jaden McDaniels is the best option in the NBA. He does provide some rim protection at 6'9" on the wing, which I think is pretty cool. Just offensively, there's just so many holes in terms of what he can really do. His catch and shoot numbers aren't great. His ability to attack off closeouts is inconsistent. There's some games where he's going off for 20 against Phoenix. It's like, oh, if you get this offensively consistently, this might be a top 10 small forward. But those games are just so few and far between. I couldn't get him on the list. But I definitely did want to just give him his flowers on how good he is defensively, that I did consider him. But it just wasn't enough for me to actually put him on the list. But I think those are the honorable mentions that we both had. Also, shout out to Brandon Miller, who I think will fly onto this list sooner rather than later. Not going to go into a whole spiel about him, but I do think he can be on this list relatively quickly. But we are getting into what people are here for. 9 minutes into the show, getting right to it. John, who was your 10th best small forward in the NBA?
At number 10, I had Khris Middleton. And the past 2 seasons, he played 55 games in the 23-24 season and 33 games in the 22-23 season. And he was on a minutes restriction over those past 2 seasons, therefore only giving you 15 points, 5 rebounds, and 5 assists with a 58% true shooting. But if we just look at the playoffs, he was still giving you 24 points per game, 8 rebounds, 5 assists, 47 38, 88 splits with 59% true shooting. Not only is he an amazing shot creator, but he can also create for others. He's a 94th percentile isolation creator in the 23-24 postseason, 88th percentile in the regular season. He shoots 40% from 3 on catch and shoot threes, 36% on pull-up threes. But I think I alluded to it in the point guard and shooting guard list. I'm just not the biggest fan of the tough shot creators who just don't make an advantage to make their offense easier. This is a guy who does not get to the free throw line as often. He does not shoot threes as much. And it's always going to be tough for Khris Middleton just because against a more athletic defense, I just don't think he would be able to really make a difference as much as he did in a Indiana Pacers series. But that's my gripe with him. That's just my major gripe with him. But he's still a solid passer. He can make the right decision on the floor multiple times a game. But I'm just not in love with the tough shot creators and the tough shot makers.
Pretty large discrepancy between your evaluation of Khris Middleton and mine. I had Khris Middleton at number 7. He was my number 7. I do agree with a lot of what you said in terms of his play style. It's definitely one of the elite shot makers in the NBA, but he is also elite off the ball in his spot up ability. He was a 40% spot up 3-point shooter last year. He was also able to create his own shot in isolation in the half court, which was extremely valuable, giving you about 1.14 points per possession in isolation last year. He's a 6'7" wing who can post up, which is extremely valuable. His ability to come off of handoffs and get into the elbow mid-range area, using that to get to the rim where his athleticism may let him down in those regards. Just finding ways to get to spots on the floor where he's extremely dangerous while being one of the most dangerous mid-range players in the NBA. I do find that to be extremely valuable. When you look at Khris Middleton, I think he led the league in mid-range efficiency last year. That's definitely something that I'm not gonna look past. Last year he was 55% on mid-range shots, which is extremely efficient offense for a team that really needed it. You alluded to the minutes restriction and stuff. I was just going into this with the thought process of fully healthy, so that stuff didn't really bother me, especially when you look at the playoffs and how consistent he was in that series, how great he was against the Indiana Pacers defense that, albeit isn't great, but they needed everything he was able to provide for them, being elite in isolation, being elite as a shot creator, as a shot maker. Khris Middleton is just, he's in that archetype of tough shot makers, and I have a lot of those guys on this list in this area, the 7 through 9, 10 area. Khris Middleton is one who I'm extremely high on in terms of what is shown in the playoffs, the consistency of it, and the fact that shooting 55% from mid-range. I mean, we can understand that tough shots are tough shots, but if you're making them at 55% clip, that's Kevin Durant numbers. Like, we can call it what we want. We can say he's not Kevin Durant, but 55% is Kevin Durant numbers. So I'm going to give Khris Middleton all the credit in the world for that. Defensively, he's definitely taken a step back with all the injuries. He's not what he used to be. Still think he's an intelligent defender. Still think the Bucks will benefit from having him when he is back this season, because that perimeter defense is shaky. So I think Khris Middleton still provides value defensively, still excellent value offensively, one of the best shooters in the league, one of the best shot makers in the league. Now, I can definitely empathize with the, he doesn't get downhill, he doesn't get the easy offense. But I think compared to some of the other tough shot makers, he's in line with them in terms of how much he's getting downhill. Probably falls behind them, but he's also maybe the most efficient mid-range 3-point scorer out of all of them. So that was enough for me in terms of the off-ball value and all of those things. I was able to give Khris Middleton the edge over those guys, and that's why he fell in at number 7. But before you give me your number 9, I want to talk about who my number 10 was, because you alluded to him last week on your shooting guards list. I had Mikal Bridges at number 10 on my small forwards list, and this is where you get to the who's a small forward, who's a power forward, who's a shooting guard. You spoke about Mikal Bridges last week. I also alluded to him last week. Very good off the ball scorer, very good spot up shooter. We had the concerns about what it would look like on the Knicks this year. He's making threes, so we were acting like the sky was falling. It seemed like he's doing okay. Defensively, I think he's taken a step back in Brooklyn. He took a step back in Brooklyn. I still haven't, like, he's not all defensive caliber in New York, in my opinion, but still does provide positive value on that end, especially as a point of attack, as someone who isn't the best on-ball defender, but is still very capable out there. His length is very disruptive. He is relatively consistent fighting through screens. Now, he's not the Jaden McDaniels, but I think you can live with that. And just how well he works off the ball as a cutter, as a shooter, all of those things still does provide excellent value to me. And he is shooting about 39% from 3 to start this season, 37% last year, was actually pretty efficient in the mid-range, I think about 42%. All of those things that I find extremely valuable. And that was enough to get me him at number 10. Just the issues of shot creation and ability to get his own and create advantages on the ball is why he fell below the shot creator archetype that I had above him. So that's why I had Mikal Bridges at 10. But knowing you had Khris Middleton at 10, I'm curious who you had at number 9.
as I said in the beginning of this show, I made 4 lists. I read the wrong one. Khris Middleton's 9, and my number 10 spot was
Okay.
Franz Wagner. So I'm just going to talk about Franz Wagner real fast. So Franz Wagner last season averaged about 20 points per game, 5 rebounds, 4 assists, 48, 28, 85 splits on 57% true shooting. To start the season this year, 18 points per game, 5 rebounds, 4 assists, 59% true shooting. I wouldn't be shocked if he could jump up this list just a little bit if he was to improve from 3, because last season it just was not good. The pull-up numbers were not as good. The catch and shoot numbers were not as good either. But when you look at his game with the things that he is allowed to do, he's a solid perimeter defender. He can play in transition. He can finish around the rim. There are so many things that you can allude to make him look like he's a player that can move up to this list. But I think what holds him back so much is just the lack of a jump shot. And we saw it in the playoffs. To be a guy who is scoring at this volume and being as an important scorer for the Orlando Magic right behind Paolo Banchero and not being able to shoot the ball is going to make it very tough for an Orlando Magic team to succeed, because there were moments in the playoffs where they just could not run a successful offense if their main 2 guys could not knock down a shot. Now, Paolo Banchero was hitting his shots from 3, but Franz Wagner was just very, very disappointing. I think he shot 26% from 3, but he still is a good playmaker and passer. He's a very low turnover type of player. And once again, I think his defense is very, very underrated on the perimeter. He beats guys to his spots. He's smart off ball. And I think he's a solid rebounder. I think he's a solid playmaker, but the 3-point shot is what's really holding me back from moving him up higher in this list.
Yeah, Franz is someone who a lot of people know how I feel about Franz Wagner. I've been very passionate speaking about how good I think he is. I actually had him around here. I had him at 9. So right above Mikal Bridges. Biggest concern was the 3-point shot last year. He's shooting it better to start this year. I think he's about 37%. So I do think he had a down year last year, but just factoring in that you got to impact the court, and if he's having a down year from 3, that's hurting his impact. So I do think he's a better shooter than he showed last year. Last year, he was shooting about 28% from 3, shooting about 29% on spot up threes. It was just bad all around. This year, he's at 37% in a limited sample of only 6 games, but definitely something to be encouraged about. The thing about Franz that I guess is what makes me so high on him is how good of a driver he is, how good he is getting downhill, how good he is at finishing. We spoke about Khris Middleton and how little of his offense comes at the rim and the easy stuff. Franz Wagner, 31% of his shots last year at the rim. This year, 37%. He's practically cut the mid-range out of his game entirely. It's either all at the rim or from 3. And if he's able to shoot the 3 at a good clip, like he seems to be doing to start this year, that levels up his game even more, because he's not taking the quote-unquote inefficient shots. He's a really good free throw shooter, really good finisher, able to get there seemingly at will. If he's able to be a good knockdown spot up 3-point shooter with capability of creation off the dribble without taking those not ill-advised, but inefficient mid-range jumpers at a 42, 43% clip, I think Franz levels up even more defensively. I think his versatility on the wing as a on-ball defender at 6'10" is extremely valuable, being able to guard 1s, 2s, and 3s, even 4s. I do think that's extremely valuable. I do think he leaves a lot to be desired in terms of rim protection at 6'10". But since we are judging him as a small forward, I don't think he's really taken away from his team's value since he's playing the small forward position. I also think he's a really underrated passer and decision maker, especially out of his drives. Just able to leverage his gravity as a driver and create open shots for guys, I think is extremely valuable. So Franz is someone who I considered higher than 9, but because of the 3-point shooting woes he experienced last year, that's why I settled with him down here. Now, Franz with a whole year under his belt of shooting the 3 at a good clip, definitely can see him climbing this list because he's so well-rounded. He's so good in every other area. But unfortunately, if you're a perimeter player and you aren't knocking down the 3 at a good clip, it does somewhat limit your value, especially when you take them at the clip that Franz did. It's not like he's a low volume guy. He did shoot them with confidence. They just didn't happen to go in last year. But the sample size of history seems to say he's a solid 3-point shooter. His first year, 35%. His second year, 36%. Last year was just a horrible 28% year for him. But I do think he can get back to normalcy, and he seems to be doing that to start the season. So I expect Franz to be a lot higher if we do this again next year, but he did fall at 9 for me and number 10 for you. So you said you had Khris Middleton at 9 and Franz at 10. So we are on to your number 8. Who do you have at number 8?
At number 8, I have Brandon Ingram. And this is another guy who falls in that tough shot making, doesn't create necessarily easy offense for himself. Last year, he averaged around 21 points per game, 6 assists, 5 rebounds per game on 49, 35, 80 splits, and 58% true shooting. And once again, 14% of his shots came from 0 to 3 feet, 15% of his shots came from 3 to 10, and his portability concerns me just with some of his off-ball restrictions. I do think he creates for others pretty well. I think he creates well out of the pick and roll, but I think what really disturbs me is in the playoffs against Lou Dort, where you could just see the strength and the athleticism that Brandon Ingram had to go up against night in and night out, especially being the number one since Zion Williamson wasn't there. Lou Dort was just knocking him off his placement. He was beating him to spots. He was contesting a lot of shots. And that's what Brandon Ingram lives off of. He lives off the mid range. He doesn't really create as much free throws as you would want him to. He doesn't really attempt as much 3-pointers as you would want him to. He just settles for the mid range time and time again. Now, he is a very, very good mid range shooter. I think he was about 50% from the mid range last season. And that is very good for me, but he is a 55th percentile isolation creator, 22nd percentile post up player. And I just don't know if I really would consider him like an elite level scorer if he's just settling on up shots time and time again.
This is the first time where we've got an agreement. I also had Brandon Ingram at 8, one spot behind Khris Middleton, obviously. For me, the issues with Brandon Ingram are pretty similar to a Khris Middleton. The issue is I don't think he's as good of a shot maker as Khris Middleton is. So that was the biggest hesitation I had with him. I do think Brandon Ingram has actually developed a lot as a playmaker, decision maker, and passer, which I do think has overall helped his offensive ceiling. I think he's actually a really good player in those departments, something that gets slept on a lot. The issue I have is it wasn't so much because of the playoff series. It was just something that has been a reoccurring theme with Brandon Ingram, is just his strength and his ability to handle physicality. And I think last postseason he wasn't fully healthy, but those flaws did seem to rear their head. Now, do I think he's as bad as whatever his numbers were in the postseason? No. But do I think those are serious flaws within his game? Yes. Last year, he was about a 48% mid-range shooter, which is really, really good. But compared to Khris Middleton's 55%, I'm going to take Khris Middleton. He's also not a very high volume 3-point guy. He shoots about 35% on about 4 attempts a game, which is mediocre efficiency on low volume. And he's shooting them more willingly this year, which I do think is a good sign for Brandon Ingram. You've seen, the more I'm watching around the league, a lot of these mid-range scorers are up in their 3-point volume this year, which I do think is just clearly a sign of the analytics movement and how important those things are. This year, he's shooting about 6 a game. He's shooting 41% this year. So we'll see how sustainable that is. But Brandon Ingram, for me, the issues of just getting downhill consistently, handling physicality, not getting knocked off his spots, all of those things that I think either Khris Middleton shares those flaws or he actually doesn't in terms of the physicality and is a better shot maker. That was enough for me to give him the edge over Brandon Ingram, who I think, even though he might be the more impactful defender at this point of his career, especially as an on-ball defender, I still think that's not enough to make up the gap in shot making and shot creation that I think Brandon Ingram falls behind, especially as you alluded to being a 55th percentile isolation guy, not great in the pick and roll. All of those things that I think leave a sour taste in my mouth when it comes to Brandon Ingram. So I ended up with Brandon Ingram at 8, but definitely considered him and Khris Middleton to be right there neck and neck with each other. They're all in that same neighborhood of, we're going to make tough shots. We're going to give you something that's hard to take away in the postseason, and you're going to like it pretty much. But Brandon Ingram at 8 for me, Brandon Ingram at 8 for you. Who is your number 7?
At number 7, I have Scottie Barnes. About 20 points, 8 rebounds, 6 assists, 56% true shooting. And I think there is still a lot left on the table for where you think Scottie Barnes can become. As of right now, I do not think he can be a number 1 offensively for a team that's contending, but he still has some pretty good signs. He can finish. He's taken more 3-pointers these past few seasons, just upping his confidence a little bit more to where he can take more threes. But as him creating for himself, he is a 49th percentile pick and roll scorer, 18th percentile isolation scorer, but he is a solid passer. He is a solid rebounder. I think he's a guy that can probably fill passing lanes, be a great help defender, can be a solid rim protector. But I just think the Toronto Raptors are asking a little too much of him defensively. I think there should be some more defenders around him to where you can use his strengths next to some strengths of some other players to make a really good defense. I think he can be the forefront of a really good defense, but the offense is just what really concerns me. Sometimes it looks a little clunky. Sometimes it just doesn't look like he's all the way there 100%. And I just don't think he's going to be an above average shooter. I don't think he's ever going to become that, but he can be a league average shooter or maybe on some low volume. But I think he can also make plays for others around him. I think he can be very good finishing around the rim, but it's just not all there yet. And I am high on Scottie Barnes as a player, as a defender, as a secondary offensive player. But as of right now, I just don't see how I can put him any higher on this list.
I did see how I could put him any higher on this list because I put him at number 5. Scottie Barnes for me is a role player cosplaying as a star, I guess, is the best way I could put it. He does everything that a role player could do to the highest degree of role playing ability, I think, while being given star responsibilities that I just don't think are what's best for him and what's best for his team in the winning aspects. But Toronto obviously aren't trying to win. You spoke about how his offense can be kind of clunky at times. I can agree with you. Only producing about 0.84 points per possession in the pick and roll, 0.7 in isolation. He really struggles in terms of generating offense for himself with the ball in his hands. But then when you look at him as his ability to just play within a system, 1.49 points per possession off cuts, 1.26 on offensive rebounds, 0.9 as a pick and roll roller. Like, he's doing all of these things that everything you'd want a role player to do, he does all of them, and he does it with high energy, high effort, and you're asking him to create more than probably he should. But I do think there are flashes of capability there. Improved as a spot up shooter this year, shot about 40% on spot up threes this year, which was really impressive. And then you also got the passing and playmaking ability, which I think is really impressive to me. He's more like a point forward type. His ability to get guys involved in transition, collapse defenses, kick out, all of those things are valuable. Now, he can fall kind of victim to some tunnel vision at times when he's looking to create for himself and he can't see openings. But I think all of those things come with age and time. And I can understand offensively, I do think he's worse than guys like Brandon Ingram. I do think he's worse than guys like Khris Middleton. But defensively, for me, he's so impactful. And that's even when I think this was maybe the first year he's been used correctly. He's always been one of the more versatile defenders in the NBA in terms of switchability. But I do think his most value comes as a defensive playmaker, defensive roamer. And I think that's finally this year where he got used there more than ever, being someone who can be backline help and provide help at the rim, being someone who can use his athleticism as a rim protector, being someone who can play weak side and deflect passes and play passing lanes and all of those things, I do think are extremely valuable. He hasn't been the elite point of attack defender that I thought he could have been coming in. Sometimes just being caught a bit flat-footed. Sometimes the energy and effort isn't there on the ball. All understandable when you're giving him the offensive burden he has, but I still do think of all the names we've said so far, by far the most impactful defender, by a solid margin, the best passer and playmaker, very good rebounder, very good athlete. Just I think leaves a lot to be desired in the self-creation role. But I've been very clear about this. I'm not one who's like, this guy can create his own shot better than this guy, so he's better than him. I don't agree with that. I don't subscribe to that. I think you can provide more value in the other areas of the game beyond just shot creation. So although I think he's probably the worst shot creator I've had on my list besides Mikal Bridges, I still think he just provides more value in every other area of the game, and overall is the more impactful player from a rebounding, playmaking, defensive playmaking, overall defense, versatility standpoint. So that's why I had Scottie Barnes at 5. But definitely could have considered him lower due to the offensive shortcomings. But not enough for me to have him down at 7. But now that we know number 7 was Scottie Barnes, I have a feeling I know who your number 6 is, but who do you have at number 6?
At number 6, I have OG Anunoby, 15 points per game, 4 rebounds, 2 assists, 59% true shooting. And this is a guy who his numbers aren't going to jump out at you, but just the pure versatility as a defender, the catch and shooting ability, just the ability to stretch the floor for this Knicks team. And we saw it take effect as soon as he got there. I think the Knicks went 20-3 as soon as they got OG Anunoby before he went down. There were moments in the playoffs where he was the best perimeter defender for Tyrese Maxey, and there was possessions where if you send the right amount of help, OG could stop Joel Embiid just for a little bit. so the help can get there. He's not the best defender for Joel Embiid, but there was moments where he has the strength and he has the weight and he has the strength to be able to guard him for a short period amount of time. And this is a guy who just plays basketball at a high level when it comes to the winning aspect. And I think I value that a little bit more when it comes to guys like Brandon Ingram or Khris Middleton or Franz Wagner, because he has that portability that you can plug into a contending team and you can be an amounts better with him on the floor. Just taking a look at last season, there were a plus 22 per 100 possessions and a plus 9 on off with OG Anunoby on the floor. He was 41% from three in the playoffs. He was 40% off the catch and 47% in the mid-range. This is somebody that complemented this Knicks team so well. He's such a great perimeter defender. And I just think him on a contending team, it raises your floor so high to the point where the winning basketball does make a play an effect into it.
Yeah, OG Anunoby, someone who I just considered a power forward. He's playing there this year, obviously next to Cat at the 5 and Mikal at the 3 and Josh Hart at the 2. So he wasn't someone I put on my list, but just to speak on OG a bit, because respectfully, I'm not sure he's going to make my power forward list of how stacked that position is. So just to speak on him, one of the few defenders in the league, you alluded to it, who I'm pretty comfortable could guard all 5 positions. I'm pretty confident he could. He's one of the few players in the league who I think can do that. He's 6'7", extremely strong, extremely physical, extremely long arms, moves extremely well for a person his size, low center of gravity, can't get pushed off his spots, but moves so well he can stick with guards like Tyrese Maxey, who you alluded to, one of the quickest players in the NBA. OG Anunoby was the best matchup for him. You alluded to the Joel Embiid stuff. Yes, he's not going to stop Joel Embiid one-on-one with no help, but no one is. But being able to push him 4 or 5 feet off his spot is amazing. Being able to contest shots high is amazing. Being one of the having some of the deadliest hands in the NBA, that's extremely valuable off the ball. I think as a defender on the wing, he's one of the best in the NBA, undoubtedly. Offensively, that's where I think once you get higher up this list, I think the shortcomings of self-creation do become more evident, and I think I'm going to start valuing those guys a bit more unless you are providing the value as a playmaker or in the other areas. Offensively, I think OG Anunoby is pretty exclusively a play finisher, whether that's spot up threes, whether that's one dribble pull-ups in the mid-range, whether that's cutting, which are all valuable traits. But when we're talking about the elite of the elite, I do think the lack of self-creation is evident. We speak about clunkiness with Scottie Barnes. I think that clunkiness applies to OG. Maybe it's just a Toronto thing. I don't know. But also just falling behind as a playmaker, decision maker. Sometimes I think he can get a bit outside of his game offensively and try to do a bit too much, which can take away from some of his offensive value. But defensively, there's really no question. I spoke about Jaden McDaniels defensively earlier and how I considered him. I think OG Anunoby is probably a better defender than Jaden McDaniels. So if I did consider him a small forward, it's very possible I would have had him on the list. No, it's guaranteed I would have had him on the list because I do think he's better than Mikal Bridges. So definitely someone who just didn't make the list due to what I would deem a position issue, but can definitely understand someone having him on their list, even as high as number 6. But we are on to your number 5. I'm pretty sure I know who this is going to be too, but who do you have at number 5?
At number 5, I have DeMar DeRozan. And I think it gets really underrated just due to DeMar DeRozan's situation on how good he actually is. I still think he's one of the best half-court creators in the league, and he's extremely efficient and versatile in the ways he can give you his buckets. He was an 86th percentile isolation creator, 93rd percentile pick and roll creator, and an 80th percentile post-up player. We have both talked about how important it is to be a post scorer in as a wing, as a guard, and how versatile you can be in getting your buckets and being extremely efficient in the mid-range. Last season, he was giving you 24 points per game, 4 rebounds, 5 assists, 48, 33, 85, splits on 58% true shooting. And the difference between him and a Khris Middleton and a Brandon Ingram to me is I just think he eats up free throws to a point that Khris Middleton and Brandon Ingram just can't do. I think he's just as efficient as those guys. He was 43% in total mid-range shots, 49% from 8 to 16 feet, 51% in the paint non-restricted area. He gets to the line 8 times a night. He was 10th in pick and roll points per game, 12th in isolation points per game. So when we look at DeMar DeRozan's game, I think he's truly as underrated as he is, because you're asking him to be the number one offensively for a Chicago Bulls team throughout multiple years. And I just don't think that's what he is anymore. And for a contending team, or for a team that's looking to make a deep run in a playoff atmosphere, I think he could be the second best scorer on the team and maybe the third best overall player. But I think it just wasn't true to who DeMar DeRozan is to be the number one on a team like Chicago, especially when Chicago was actively trying to make the playoffs for multiple years. I just don't think that's who DeMar DeRozan really is. And I loved his signing with the Sacramento Kings. I think the Sacramento Kings desperately needed another guy that could create more, just like how De'Aaron Fox can. I don't know if you would want to lean on Malik Monk being the full-time secondary creator, so bringing in DeMar DeRozan, how he can play off handoffs with Domantas Sabonis, how he can pull up in the mid-range, how he can fade away from the post, just a completely versatile scorer inside the arc, and that's why I have him at number 5.
Yeah, I had DeMar DeRozan at 6. I do think the overall, I guess, consensus on DeMar has kind of gone a bit too far in the negative direction. I think he's still an extremely valuable player, especially in the half court, as a shot creator for himself, as others, elite in the pick and roll, elite in isolation, elite out the post, all extremely valuable areas of the court. One of the best mid-range shooters in the NBA. From a volume perspective, I don't think there's really anyone kind of like him. It's him, Kevin Durant, Shea, Embiid, really, in terms of volume. Extremely efficient from the mid-range, especially that free throw line area, where he's most dangerous, the elbows, etc. Him being able to get to the free throw line despite not getting to the rim a whole bunch is extremely valuable. He loves to use those up fakes, kind of like a copy of Kobe in a sense, able to just generate free throws even from the outside. Extremely valuable. As a decision maker and passer, he's evolved every year, especially once he went to San Antonio. That really just helped grow his game in that regard. Defensively, I'm not the highest on DeMar DeRozan defensively. His lateral quickness on the outside is definitely something that teams can attack, which is why teams often use him as a low man or a weak side defender, and he's not going to provide much resistance there. He's pretty aware of his assignments. The issue is he just doesn't have the explosive pop and the burst to be able to really make an impact in those regards as much as you would like someone in that position to do so, but you can't have him on the ball because of obvious limitations. So I would call him maybe a slight negative if I'm being extremely optimistic and neutral on that side of the ball. But I think the elephant in the room with DeMar DeRozan has always been, how does it translate to the postseason? That's always been the elephant in the room with DeMar DeRozan. You would think someone who has a game that's based on the mid-range, and we speak about it like teams don't like to take away the mid-range because everything's at the rim or on the three-point line. So if you have one of the most deadly mid-range shooters in the NBA, you would think that they would be one of the most effective postseason scorers, and that just hasn't been the case for DeMar DeRozan. There's probably a bunch of reasons why, and I don't want to just bash on DeMar DeRozan, especially when he hasn't been in the playoffs in about 2 years. So here's just hoping that in a system like Sacramento, with more off-ball movement, with more actions to get him going downhill, getting him momentum where he can use his shot making and his counters and all of those things to his advantage. Maybe this might be one of the few times where he does translate to the postseason. But I still do think he provides just enough value as a scorer, just enough value as a half-court creator that I am going to have him at 6. I just think overall, I think Scottie Barnes just impacts the game in a larger facet of ways and is overall just a more impactful player, despite DeMar DeRozan being, I think, clearly the best shot creator I've named so far. And I don't even think it's particularly close. DeMar DeRozan is a gifted shot maker, shot creator. Just overall not enough, I think, impact in the ancillary areas. So I ended up having him at 6, but definitely can understand DeMar DeRozan at 5. But before we get your number 5, and before we get your number 4, we have a super chat from Terry with 2 dads. Love is love. Not gonna say anything. He said, I don't know who's the best, but the cutest is Kelly Oubre. Once again, love is love. I'm not here to judge. Shout out to you for the super chat. I appreciate anyone who does send a super chat through. Yeah, obviously, yeah. Shout out to Kelly Oubre, man. But yeah, definitely appreciate anyone who sends a super chat. Hope you guys are enjoying the video. Just leave a like if you are. It boosts the video in the algorithm, I'm told. So there you go. Please like the video if you can. But with that being
my
said,
grandmother's watching, so hey grandma, how you doing?
Hey, tell your grandma to like the video too, man. No excuses for anyone. Make sure you like the video, Grandma John D. Tito Albandito with another super chat. Shout out to you. He said Bobby Portis' house was broken into. Shake my head, Domo. Didn't know about that, but
Did not.
hopefully everything's okay. Crime is not good, guys.
It's
There you go.
not.
Crime
It's
is not
not.
good. No matter how bad you may think someone is at basketball, that's not an excuse to break into their home.
Yeah.
Also, shout out to Joel Embiid for putting that reporter in his place. But
Yeah. I really appreciated that one. That was
yeah,
very
but
great.
so that might be the one time where hey, that crime, man, I'll let that one slide. But we're getting sidetracked a little bit. Number 4, who do you have at number 4?
At number 4, I have Jalen Williams. 19, 4, and 5 last season on 52, 43, 81 splits with 62% true shooting. And I think this is a guy who can be a great number 2 offensively in a postseason run. But luckily, there's times where he has to be the number 2, and there's times where he has to be the number 3. So he's in almost the perfect position. He's extremely efficient, whether it's from the mid range or the 3-point line. He gets to his spots really well. And I think one thing he did really good last season was just being that primary ball handler where SGA was off the floor. I really liked his 2-man game between him and Chet Holmgren. I think the way he attacks in the pick and roll is great. I think his pull-up twos are great. He's an 87th percentile pick and roll creator. And this is just a guy who knows his spots. He gets to them and he finishes efficiently. He's 43% off the catch, 3-pointers. He's 42% on pull-up threes, 49% mid-range shooter, and he's 70% in the restricted area. And I think I was just a little bit disappointed in the playoffs to where he was just not making his outside shots as effectively, but it's his first playoff run. That's not something I'm going to completely dive into as something that could be an overreaction, but he was still an 88th percentile spot up player. He's very good off ball and he plays well with SGA and Chet Holmgren, just being able to space the floor. And when you have a guy who's so elite in the mid range, when you have 2 guys who are extremely elite in the mid range, I just think it's very effective for the team. And then him being in the perfect role and playing well with the players that he has next to him, I think he's going to improve a lot this season. And yeah, even outside of him kind of being disappointing in the playoffs, I think he was still giving you 19, 7, and 4. I just think the efficiency was lower, but I think he has so many options offensively to be effective, whether it's playmaking, whether it's spot up shooting, whether it's mid-range creation, whether it's pick and roll creation. He's great off ball, great just spotting up and shooting, to where I'm comfortable with him being my number 4. And there is a chance he can move up in this list. I'm very, very, very confident in that.
Yeah, I think the 4 names now are going to be pretty much consensus. Now the order is up for interpretation. I had J-Dub at number 4. The numbers would suggest he's probably even higher. I mean, there's not an area on the floor where he wasn't efficient. Pick and roll ball handler 1 point per possession, in transition 1.25, as a spot up player 1.19, in isolation 0.92, as a cutter 1.4, coming off handoffs 1.1. Coming off screens in general, 1.16. As a pick and roll man, 1.07. There was just nowhere where he wasn't efficient. And then when you start factoring his playmaking, even more effective, especially out of the pick and roll, especially in isolation, being able to make reads in those regards. And defensively, his length is extremely disruptive, able to force turnovers. I know the OKC Thunder definitely treated Kyrie and Luka as if they were the most dangerous players ever. But J-Dub was able to even contain those guys in isolation for limited times, which is extremely impressive. His foot speed is great, 6'5", 7'2" wingspan. His ability to be a defensive playmaker, cause havoc, is amazing. Huge part of OKC's defensive identity is J-Dub and Shea and their length and ability to disrupt. He's a huge part of that. I guess the hesitation for me with J-Dub is where you say his quote-unquote struggles in the playoffs, you're more willing to look past because of it's his first time and it's a new experience. I think there might be some just more overarching flaws within his game that I think teams can key in on, which ultimately do lead to him being slightly less effective. Now, that's not me saying he's never going to play well in the playoffs, and I still think he was actually pretty good in this year's postseason. I just do think, just generally speaking, I do think, even though he's pretty much like Shea version 2 for their team, in terms of how he's operated and how he's used, I do think he does have clearly less burst and explosiveness than Shea does in terms of change of pace and acceleration and then deceleration. which makes his finishes in the postseason tougher than what Shai's would be. And his ability to get to the rim and create easier opportunities at the basket definitely aren't as seamless as Shai, who's able to stop on a dime and then go again, whereas J-Dub doesn't have that same wiggle to his game, which is why I think his shots become inherently more tough in the postseason compared to Shai. But I do think he's done some things to remedy that for this season, becoming a more high-volume three-point shooter. Him and Shai have both made that adjustment. Once again, I think the analytics have a huge part to play in that. But him becoming a higher volume three-point shooter is definitely, I think, something that's done to remedy that, especially a higher volume pull-up three-point shooter, which I do think is going to be extremely valuable. He's also someone who just doesn't get to the free throw line a whole bunch. So when I think he has struggles with getting to the rim consistently, then he doesn't get to the free throw line consistently, and he wasn't someone who was a high volume three-point shooter, he just doesn't really dominate from the most efficient areas on the court. So although he's efficient from everywhere, he's not maximizing his efficiency from the most dangerous areas on the court. And I think when you do rely on supreme touch and using your length to finish, and as opposed to being able to generate the easier ones like a Shai, like a Luka, who's able to use his strength to manufacture easy opportunities at the rim, I do think those things can hold him back in a slight regard. But this is why he's never going to be Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. But I also did have him at number 4 because of how special I do think he is as a secondary or tertiary offensive option, how valuable he can be on and off the ball, all of the versatility and utility he provides alongside being a very, very good defender. Wouldn't call him an all-NBA level defender, but definitely the next step below that for me. So that's why I had J-Dub at number 4, but ultimately couldn't get much higher for me. But who do you have at number 3?
I have Paul George at number 3, and his role this season is going to be really good for him and how he plays. Now, there has been some type of discourse on Paul George in the playoffs and how he's just been able to perform in the past few years. But last season, he averaged about 23 points per game, 5 rebounds, 4 assists, 47, 41, 91 splits, 61% true shooting. And he also played 74 games, which is, I think, the highest in his entire Clipper tenure. If I'm, I don't have the exact number on that, but I think he does still create at a very high level. I still think he's an amazing shooter, and all these things are going to come to light even more when he comes to Philadelphia, or when he plays his first game in Philadelphia. He's 53% from 10 to 16 feet, 45% from mid-range as a whole. He's a 95th percentile pick-and-roll creator. He's a 94th percentile spot-up player. He was a +9 net rating for the Clippers and a +14 on-off. And I still think that with the Sixers and how they run their two-man game with Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid, and how able Tyrese Maxey is to make the defense collapse to him, I think Paul George is going to flourish in that area. I still think he creates well in the isolation. I still think he's athletic enough to get past his defenders. Now, I do think he has fell off as his rim pressure, and I do think he has taken a regression as a defender, but I still think that the way he's going to be able to really play with Embiid and Maxey is going to open up a lot more opportunities for him, and he's still going to be a 20-plus point per game scorer, and he's still going to be extremely efficient.
Yeah, Paul George for me, also had him at number 3. I think despite what the highlights may suggest, I know we've all heard the Erykah Badu theme song for Paul George, and then he gets shifty, and it's elite. I think Paul George is at his most valuable away from the basketball. I think that's where he's at his best. I think that's where he's maximized. I think that's what's going to make him so dangerous for Philly. You alluded to it, one of the best shooters in the league. This past year, 47% on spot-up threes. That's exceptional. Now, he's only shooting about 3 a game, but if we can up that volume, get him to higher volume threes, higher volume spot-up threes, higher volume movement, and all of those things where he doesn't have to create for himself as much, I think the efficiency is going to continue to rise. I think last year was his most efficient year of his career, but I think that can continue to elevate. His shot creation in general, I think the reason it's not as valuable as I think it used to be is because we're going to go back to the thing we said about Brandon Ingram and Demar and Khris Middleton. He's just not getting to the rim like he used to. I'm a big believer in terms of the most valuable things an offensive player can do is collapse a defense. And the most common way to collapse a defense is by breaking the paint, getting 2 feet in the paint, because that's when teams are most likely to help. So Paul George not doing that in extremely high levels, settling for mid-range jumpers in isolation. The amount of times where Paul George would beat his man and then snatch back to take a contested mid-range jumper, those things just lose value for me, especially when he's asked to be scoring number one, which he was asked to do in the postseason. That's not his role. That's not where Paul George is maximized. So I'm not going to hold it against Paul George too much that he doesn't thrive in that role anymore, because that's just not his game. But I do think as a secondary, tertiary, offensive option, offensive player, that's where he's going to thrive. That's where he's going to shine. That's where he's going to be elite as a spot-up shooter, as a movement shooter, as someone who plays off other people's advantage creation, where he can attack off closeouts really quickly and then get downhill. He still has enough explosion where if you give him a runway, he can elevate, he can finish. The issue is being able to generate those advantages himself. But once you play next to a Joel Embiid or a speed demon in Tyrese Maxey, those things are going to be just made so much easier for Paul George, where I think he's going to be maximized. And defensively, I think while his on-ball defense has certainly regressed in recent years, his off-ball defense, his playmaking, his ability to get through screens is still really, really strong. Definitely not an all-NBA defensive caliber guy anymore, but still a very strong off-ball wing defender who can make plays, as a defensive playmaker, which is extremely valuable, still has great length. And in a smaller scaled back offensive role, I expect that engagement to be even higher. So unironically, I did consider Paul George even higher than this, but I just settled on number 3 because of the flaws I believe that exist in terms of rim pressure and tough shot taking, and just overall being that shot creator. Although the tough shots are really cool when they go in terms of effectiveness, I do think he does just fall behind the guys I had at number 1 and number 2, but did settle with Paul George at number 3, and I'm pretty comfortable in doing so. But we are here at the top 2 now. I know a lot of people might be disappointed because they haven't heard LeBron James and Kevin Durant and Kawhi and Jason Tatum and whoever. But whether we like it or not, those guys have been playing the power forward position for
years
a while
Yeah.
now. Now, do I think LeBron James is a small forward on all-time lists? Yes. But as you can tell by the title, these are for 24-25. And in the modern NBA, these guys are all playing the 4. So expect to see them on next week's list. So if you were really hyped for the small forward list because you thought you was going to hear those guys, who's the best of those guys, tap in next week. Next week is going to be your favorite episode, I'm sure of it. The LeBron fans are going to be mad. The KD fans are going to be mad. All of those guys are going to be very mad. So I can definitely, everyone's going to be mad next week, and you're going to tell us that we don't know ball and all of those things. So be prepared for that next week. But for this week, I guess I'm sorry to disappoint, if that makes sense. I don't know.
One thing. If LeBron, KD, and Jason Tatum and all those guys were on this list, you really think they're not going to be on the thumbnail?
Come on, man. We know how to make content. Like, let's be serious here.
Like, those guys be on the thumbnail.
Those guys would definitely be on the thumbnails if they were to be included on these lists. So I mean, we put the right names on the thumbnail. We put the right people on the thumbnail so that you guys weren't tricked. But we are getting to that point. We are at the top 2. I actually don't know which direction you're going to go with this. So
I didn't.
Who do you have at number 2?
Now, both of these players, I think, have been slightly overrated with their recent playoff success, just a little bit. You know, we're starting to see Jaylen Brown say, "Oh, Jaylen Brown's the best Celtic." You know, I don't know about all that. I do have Jaylen Brown at number 2, and he averaged 23 points per game last season, about 4 assists and 5 rebounds. He's still a great on-ball defender. I think he does fall asleep off ball a lot, to the point where it could hurt his defense at times, but you have so many great off-ball defenders around him to where it doesn't really get shown as much. His defensive liabilities don't really get shown as much with his off-ball play, but he's still really good at getting to the rim. He's 52% in the paint non-restricted, 44% in the mid-range. He was second in transition points, but he was just a really inconsistent shooter over the postseason. I think he averaged about 24 points, 6 rebounds, and 3 assists. I think in the finals, he was very inconsistent with his shot. I think you could say that about a lot of the players in the NBA finals for the Celtics. But the playmaking, I just don't think is going to ever be as something that he executes at an above average rate. With the guy that I have at number 1, I just think he can be a better number 1 option offensively than Jaylen Brown can. I just don't know if setting a whole bunch of screen and rolls or just having Jaylen Brown creating the isolation time in and time out for your offense is really going to set him up for success. And he still is a very good defender, in my opinion, but I just think those limitations would really take me away from having him at number one. But he is a 70th percentile post-up player, a 70th percentile pick and roll creator. But I just don't think offensively he has that upside like the number one guy, to where he could be my number one and carry the load offensively as my number one did. So
you can spoil it if you want, and say who your number one is.
Jimmy Butler is my number one.
Okay,
but
there you go,
yeah,
Jimmy Butler.
wasn't.
I'm gonna just speak on Jaylen Brown, and then I'll reveal where I had those two guys ranked, because we are on Jaylen Brown now. Jaylen Brown for me is he's tough. I don't know. I guess tough is the word I would use to describe it. The consensus opinion on Jaylen Brown has definitely become more overwhelmingly positive. Obviously because of the playoff round, the finals MVP, the conference finals MVP. Also, his individual play seems to have developed in ways that he's no longer as flawed as he used to be maybe 2-3 seasons ago. The issues I have with Jaylen Brown have been quite vocalized in terms of his feel as a playmaker, his handle, his ability to make the advanced reads, his half-court shot creation. All of those things I still think are valid concerns. And I'm going to always say, every time we bring up a Celtics player, I do think every single one of them is in the most optimized role in terms of spacing, in terms of scheme, in terms of talent, that is realistically attainable in the NBA. So when we talk about how does this player translate to higher ranked teams, better teams, I don't think that exists for Boston Celtics players. I think they are at the maximum capacity of what a team can be functionally in the NBA. So if I think Jaylen Brown's handle is flawed, I can't be like, how would it look if he had better spacing? This is maximized spacing. If I think he's a questionable decision maker, how would his decisions look if he was in a situation where he didn't draw as much defensive attention? I think this is the least amount of defensive attention Jaylen Brown will ever draw. So I think with Jaylen Brown, I also didn't have him at number one. Personally, for me, defensively, I think that's where he's had the most growth. He used to be a hell of an on-ball defender, but the off-ball defense was something I just didn't like. But I think he's become more engaged off the ball. I think his role and responsibility has become more clear off the ball, and he's able to execute that. He's even shown flashes of rim protection, which I think were extremely valuable. So I think defensively, I've become more and more encouraged or intrigued by Jaylen Brown's defense. But offensively, I still see the flaws with the handle. I still see the flaws with the decision making. It just so happens that with 5-out spacing and a lot of one-on-one opportunities, I think they get less exacerbated. But I still think they are still there. And I can understand people not agreeing with this or thinking I'm being a bit overly negative with Jaylen Brown, which is definitely understandable. But for me, I can't get over the fact that that handle is still loose. Like it is. And and I'm not a huge fan of extreme advanced numbers, but when it seems to be that the team performs just as well without you, that has to mean something to me. That has to mean something. And this is a large sample of minutes where the Celtics don't really fall off without Jaylen Brown. Whether that's in the regular season or the postseason, they still perform very well. Jaylen Brown is an extremely dominant transition player, one of the best in the NBA in transition or semi-transition. But in the half court, when the advantage isn't created already, I just see that's where I think falls short. And someone said plus minus is relative. Yes, I mean plus minus is dependent on who's replacing you, the talent around you, but he has by far the clearest negative indicators on the team, like by far, by any metric, but beyond just how the team plays without him. With any metric, he has by far the worst advanced numbers. And I think that's not coincidence. I don't put all the stock in those numbers. I don't really put much in them. But when all of them are pointing towards one thing, I do think that's room for curiosity. So that's all I'm saying with that. But for me, Jimmy Butler at number one, which I can understand people being more concerned with that. I just think we understand what we see about playoff Jimmy, and in the regular season he falls off. I understand like that concern, and I feel a lot of that is because a lot of guys don't see impact beyond like scoring.
Box scores.
Like Jimmy Butler is still producing very high level regular season impact, even if he's not putting up 28 a game like he does in the postseason. Last year, let me just find his numbers. Last year, 21, 5 and 5, 50% from the field practically, 41% from three on extremely low volume, getting to the line 8 times a game. But he's the best playmaker on his team. He's the second best off-ball defender on his team, because I'm still going to give Bam that. So second best off-ball defender on his team, the best defensive playmaker on his team, the best scorer on his team. And the way in which he scores is actually pretty similar to Jaylen Brown in terms of physical, getting to his spots, bumping people off their spots, all of those things. But I just think he's more reliable in the half court than Jaylen Brown is. Where Jaylen Brown is more of an open court player, I think Jimmy Butler is more of a half court player, which I think is more valuable in the postseason. And I think is a large part why you've seen Jimmy Butler have so much success in the postseason. Now, everyone knows I'm a big believer in this playoff Jimmy stuff. I'm a big believer that this playoff Jimmy stuff is overblown. Like, I don't think he's the best playoff performer ever or any of those things. But I do think he is a very good player performer pretty much consistently, especially when he's healthy. Now, I can understand the concerns being how often is this guy healthy? But I'm doing these lists assuming health for everyone. So next week's power forward list, expect to see Kawhi Leonard on it, just for example. I'm doing these lists assuming everyone's healthy. His processing of the game is very good. His ability to understand where he and his teammates need to be, very valuable. Playing with less spacing than most other guys in the NBA, being able to maximize the spacing he has. All of those things are extremely valuable to me. But if I'm being honest, I do think the small forward position has the worst top 2 of all the positions in the NBA. And that's not to knock Jimmy Butler or Jaylen Brown. But if I compare Jimmy Butler and Jaylen Brown to Devin Booker and Donovan Mitchell and Anthony Edwards, or to Luka, Shea, and Steph, or to whoever you want to say is the best power forwards in the league, or whoever you want to say are the best centers in the league, I do think this is probably the lowest standard of the top 2. So I think I could convince myself to have Jaylen Brown at 1, but I also could convince myself to have Jaylen Brown at 3. It just depends on how I feel about his half-court execution, his handle, his playmaking on the day. But I wanted to give him enough respect and have him at number 2 because what he did in the postseason, his value was still immense there. I just do think he does fall behind Jimmy Butler for me. And I think if people are interested, I think just looking at some of Jaylen Brown's advanced numbers, not taking them for a fact or say this guy's worse than that guy, but just look at them and see if you can understand why they may fall behind your initial estimation of him. And I'm not saying that they are right, because you know my opinion on a lot of these advanced stats. But if they are all painting him as the 5th, or in some cases the 6th most impactful Celtic, just maybe watch some games from last year, watch some games from this year, and just see if you could see why those things might come out that way. Not saying they are correct once again, but just look at why you think these things might happen. Because I do think if you start paying attention more closely to just Jaylen Brown, you might see that maybe he's not as impactful as the finals MVP would definitely suggest. But that is my number 1, Jimmy Butler, and number 2, Jaylen Brown. But if you want to speak on Jimmy Butler, now is the time, because I kind of rambled on for about 2 years talking about Jimmy Butler and Jaylen Brown. So now
the difference between Jimmy and Jaylen Brown for me was just, I don't think Jaylen Brown could carry the load that Jimmy Butler has had to do offensively throughout the past few years. I mean, when they get to the finals, and both times they got to the finals, and even when they went to the conference finals against the Celtics, I just don't think Jaylen Brown has the efficiency from spacing the floor or just having the handle to create. And he's not the playmaker that Jimmy is, even though Jimmy isn't setting the world on fire with his playmaking. But I just don't think Jaylen Brown is above average. I think he could be average or below average as a playmaker. And you said it best. I mean, I think we look at Jaylen Brown and say, I don't think the situation is going to get any better than what he is in right now. So I don't know. I would have Jimmy Butler over at number 1 just because of the load that he's taking on offensively every single postseason.
Yeah, that's kind of I'm not a huge believer in a number one is better than a number two always, because sometimes it's situational when different things happen. But someone said, am I a big fan of Vorp? No. But for reference, if we were to just bring up Vorp, and I were to look for Jaylen Brown standing in Vorp, it would be quite low. Jaylen Brown, in terms of Vorp, ranked, bear with me as I try and find this on the fly. Either I've scrolled past him or he's very low. He is number 70 in the NBA, number 70 in VORP. His VORP this past year was, bear with me, his VORP was a 1.6. For reference, that's below guys like Naz Reid, Emmanuel Quickly, Tobias Harris. For reference, and I don't believe this stat is indicative of how bad Jaylen Brown may or may not be, but he is by far the worst Celtic starter on that stat. Box plus minus, the same thing happens. So my point is, if they're all pointing towards one thing, not saying they are right, but maybe just watch and see if you can see why they might be saying that. That's all I'm saying. So that's all I'm putting out there. Once again, I need to keep clarifying this because someone's gonna be like, you said you don't like VORP and box plus minus. I don't. I'm saying if all of those stats, all of the advanced stats are pointing to one thing, maybe just rewatch and see if you can see why they might be saying that. And maybe you still won't see it. And maybe there is no reason they're saying that. But I would just encourage people to rewatch Celtics games or watch current Celtics games and see if you can see what Jaylen Brown may be doing or may not be doing that is leading to his advanced numbers not being as eye-popping as other people. Is it because he's not as good of a playmaker? Is it because he misses advanced reads? Is it because his defensive rotations aren't consistent? Is it because he's not great crashing the glass? Is it because he's not great in the half court? All of those things are stuff to look out for. But I'm gonna be honest. I spoke to John D before the show. This isn't a list I'm entirely passionate about. I'm not entirely sure that Jaylen Brown is worse than Jimmy Butler. I'm not entirely sure that Paul George is worse than Jaylen Brown. I'm not entirely sure that J-Dub is worse than Paul George. I'm not entirely sure that Scottie Barnes is better than DeMar DeRozan. I'm not entirely sure that Franz Wagner is worse than DeMar DeRozan. This was a list that was extremely close for me. And there wasn't a lot of things separating a lot of these guys. So I could definitely remake this list 2 weeks from now and it'd be completely different. That's how close I think the small forward list is. But I do want to show you guys what we did ultimately come up with, because they were similar but also different. So there's that. But there you go. This is our top 10 small forwards. John D, if you want to read yours out from 10 to 1.
Number 10 was Franz Wagner. I had him between 8 and 11. Number 9 was Khris Middleton. I had him between 8 and 11 as well. Brandon Ingram, I had him between 5 and 8. And OG, I had him between, I switched it a little bit. Yeah. So number 10 is Franz, 8 to 11. Khris, 8 to 11. 8, Brandon Ingram, 5 to 8. 7, Scottie Barnes. I had him between 5 and 8. At 6, I had OG. I had him between 6 and 10. At number 5, I had DeMar DeRozan. I had him between 4 and 6. At number 4, I had J-Dub, 4 to 6. At number 3, I had PG. I had him anywhere between 2 and 3. Jaylen Brown and Jimmy Butler at 1 and 2. I had them anywhere between 1 and 3 as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And for me, I had Mikal Bridges at 10. I considered him as low as 13. Obviously behind guys like Klay and MPJ, and even a little bit behind Jaden McDaniels, but that was kind of a reach. And I considered him as high as 9. Franz Wagner, I considered from 6 through 9, but ultimately settled on 9. Brandon Ingram, 6 through 9. Khris Middleton, I considered from 6 through 10, so considered him below everyone on this list. Mainly because of just some concerns with health and injuries and stuff. I can understand having him lower. DeMar DeRozan, 6 through 9. Scottie Barnes, I kind of felt comfortable having him above DeMar DeRozan, so I only really considered him above J-Dub, but not really much lower. J-Dub, I considered above Paul George or below Scottie Barnes, so 3 through 5. Paul George, I considered 2 through 4. Jaylen Brown, I considered 1 through 3. And I didn't really consider Jimmy Butler below number 2. So that is the list I came up with. This is the list John D came up with. leave your list down below. Ideally, you don't just leave a list that has LeBron James, Kevin Durant, and Kawhi Leonard all on it.
Hopefully
because we've already explained why those guys are not on the list. So they will be on next week's list unless they don't make the top 10. Who knows? But I'm pretty confident they will.
100%.
You guys voted that Jimmy Butler was the best small forward in the NBA on a poll that ended 51-48. Doesn't add up, but we'll just say those other 1% just their vote got lost in translation. I don't know. But yeah, Jimmy Butler was voted by you guys as the best small forward in the NBA, but it was very close, something I can definitely understand. Before we get out of here, we do have 2 super chats. Shout out to I Like Burritos. He is a Rockets fan. He said, Fred, a top 10 point guard when he's trying to be Osama. Dub Joel. Yeah, Fred VanVleet is having a bad start to the season, to say the least. But we are not talking about the Rockets over here. Enough people get mad that we talk about the Rockets on Players Choice, so we don't need to do that here. Modest Review said, Mars, why are you not a huge fan of VORP or BPM, etc.? VORP and BPM are just box score stats, which is why I'm not a huge fan of them. They do derive wholly from the box score. I think the box score leaves out a lot of information. There's only so much it can capture, and even then, where it does capture, doesn't really tell you the whole story. So when you have stats that are entirely derived from the box score, I do think they lose a lot of value. For anyone who doesn't know, VORP is just the rate stat of box plus minus. So VORP is the cumulative equivalent of box plus minus. Box plus minus is like the per game equivalent. So box plus minus doesn't take into account games played. VORP does take into account game played, but it's practically the same thing. Not a huge fan of any just all-in-one box score metrics. I think if you are going to use advanced stats, I would stay away from ones that entirely use the box score. Any advanced people consider true shooting an advanced metric. I don't know why, but that's the one that's the one I use the most.
I love true shooting.
I do think there are better scoring efficiency stats coming out, ones that factor in like turnovers while scoring, like turnovers and scoring attempts. I do think that should factor into scoring efficiency. And also, if you miss a shot and get an offensive rebound and put it right back in, I don't think that should count as a 50% true shooting. I think that should be worth something more because you didn't really take 2 possessions to score those points. So I do think those stats are going to be more readily available that factor in those things. And I think once they are, I'm going to use that stat more for scoring efficiency. But for now, true shooting. I like net differentials with context, of course. Any other advanced stats, I don't know. You'd have to start naming them and I'll tell you if I'm fully aware of them. I don't have a degree in stats, so like my understanding is definitely lower than most people, but I just know which ones I'm comfortable using, and true shooting is like at the top of that list. So yeah. That's why I'm not a huge fan of BPM and VORP and some of those other stats, but true shooting is about the extent of where I'm going to go. But next week, power forward lists, looking forward to it. Then the week after that, the centers lists. And then we will be done with our top 10s at each position, and we will get into some new things, some great content, hopefully for you guys. Plans on being for the whole season, so we've got a long way to go.
A whole lot of basketball to be talked about. It's not
so far. We've got 3 weeks in a row with content. 3 weeks in a row with content. So everyone, be grateful. This is a new Mars Talk Sports record. We are steady grinding. But until next week, I will be on the panel this upcoming week. John D, where can everyone find you?
Everybody can find me at the Buzzer Sports on YouTube. I have my own podcast. It's just me, Dolo. Once every week, I try to maybe Wednesday or Thursday, I do reaction videos. I do post-game videos. I do what ifs. I also do draft breakdowns. College basketball is right around the corner. So if you want to learn about some of the prospects coming into the 2025 NBA draft, you are at the best place possible over at the Buzzer Sports. I try to upload every single day, if not every other day. You're never going to see a stretch of time where it's like 3-4 days and I haven't uploaded anything. You're always going to get some content out of me. So if you guys like that, if you guys like what you hear, go ahead. Hit at the Buzzer Sports up, man. We almost at 1,000 subs. Almost there.
There you go. John's links are in the description. If you hate me for being inconsistent, you should make sure you go subscribe to him because he is the opposite of inconsistent. We have about 100 people still in here watching this outro. If you haven't subscribed, make sure to subscribe. Let's make John D get some money out of this YouTube thing, man. Get him monetized. we getting close to it. But thank you guys for watching. I enjoyed making all of these lists so far. Next week and the week after are probably going to be you guys' favorite because they are the most controversial. So looking forward to that. Make sure you tap in. Shout out to everyone who sent super chats. Shout out to everyone who liked the video. But until next week, I will see you guys when I see you. Thank you guys for watching. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and all that good stuff. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye.